Okay, it's time for us to start our last class on between the Testaments, and so we're going to be doing that at this time. And we were studying last time the coronation of Christ as King, Acts chapter 2, verses 29 through 36. And so we will continue with our study of that as we go over, if you will, to Acts chapter 2, verses 29 through 36. Here, what you find coronation of Christ as King is vigorously taught in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, but it is just as vigorously denied by many religious people. This has come about because of the preconceived ideas foisted on a good people by those of a premillennial persuasion. Those who espouse this doctrine and says that truly Jesus came to establish his kingdom, but the unbelieving Jews crucified him, and thus was not able to bring in the kingdom, and he substituted the church instead. That's the basis of the premillennial doctrine, and yet there are many things wrong with this doctrine in this office, which are these: this making unbelieving the men more powerful than that of the God of heaven, and we know that that is not true. Denies the fact that Jesus, according to Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, was prophesied to be crucified, Revelation 13:8, John 12, verse 27. It also flies in the face of Jesus' teaching that the gates of hell or Hades shall not prevail against his church, Matthew 16:18, 19, that is his kingdom. So this means that Satan won. If God's plan of redemption prepared from the foundation of the world could be thwarted by the conniving men of the first century, what would keep the same thing from happening when Jesus comes to set up the kingdom again? And so it's my firm conviction that this is a damnable heresy, and souls are at stake. And so there are five lines of thought that I would like to present on the coronation of that of Christ as King from the Psalms, the prophets, and the parables, and the passages on the ascension and the Pentecostal pronouncement. And the reason why we're doing this is because we've studied the things that the Bible has pointed out to us in reference to that the coming of the kingdom. Since we are dealing with that, then we notice also that when we think about the kingdom as the kingdom has come, uh, then we would know that since the kingdom has come, it's here today, the kingdom being that of the church itself. And so, if you'll notice with me in Psalm 27, 7 through 8, he says there, lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. I lift up your heads, O ye gates, even lift them up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the established forever, and build up thy throne to all generations. If his children forsake my law and walk not in my judgment, if they break my statutes and keep not my commandments, then will I visit their transgression with the rod. Lost my place again with the rod, and he says, if they break my statutes and keep not my commandments, then I and their iniquity will with stripes. Nevertheless, he goes on, my loving kindness will not utterly take from him, nor suffer my faithfulness to fall. My covenant will I not break, and I offer the thing that is gone out of my lips. Once have I sworn by my holiness that I will not lie unto David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever as the moon and as a faithful witness of heaven. So, God's covenant, according to the psalmist David, that this covenant with David and his seed would be a spiritual seed of that of David, the Messiah. Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 1, and Romans chapter 1 and verse 3. So the fleshly seed sitting on the throne of Konai, Jeremiah 22 and verse 30. Therefore, these psalms are not speaking of David nor to his fleshly seed, but of his spiritual seed, Jesus Christ. That's Psalm 24, verses 7 through 10. And so when we stop now and turn to that of the prophets, we find that Samuel said, uh, that chapter 7, verse 12, and when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt keep sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chastise him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. In thy house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. Isaiah 9, 6, and 7. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. The increase of his government the peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David, and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice from henceforth evermore. The zeal of the Lord of the hosts will perform it. Then Zechariah states in Zechariah chapter 6, 12, and 13, and speak unto him, saying, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, behold, the man whose name is the branch, and he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build a temple of the Lord, even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne, and he shall be a priest upon his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. Then Daniel tells us in Daniel 7, 13, 14, and I saw in the night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all people, nations, and language should serve him. His dominion as in an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. The Son of Man will go to the Ancient of Days. He will be given a dominion, glory, and a kingdom. All peoples, nations, and language will serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is that which shall not be destroyed. In Luke chapter 19, beginning verse 11, down to verse 27, the Bible says, and as they heard these things, he added and spake a parable, because he was nigh to Jerusalem, because they thought that the kingdom of God should immediately appear. He said, therefore, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. And he called his 10 servants to deliver them 10 pounds, and said unto them, occupy till I come. But his citizens hated him, and sent a message after him, saying, we will not have this man to reign over us. And it came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Then came the first, saying, Lord, thy pound have gained 10 pounds. And he said unto them, well, thou good servant, because thou hast been faithful in very little, thou hast authority over 10 cities. The second came, and Lord, thy pounds have gained 5 pounds. And he said likewise to him, be thou also over 5 cities. And another came and says, Lord, behold, here is thy pound, which I kept laid up in a napkin. For I feared thee, because thou art an austere man. Thou takest up that thou layest not down, and reapest that thou dost not sow. And he said unto him, out of thy own mouth will I judge thee, thou wicked servant. Thou knewest that I was an austere man, taken up that I laid not down, and reaping that I did not sow. Wherefore then gavest not thou my money into the bank, and at my coming I might have required my own with usury. And he said unto them, and stood by, take from him the pound, and give it to him that hath 10 pounds. And they said unto him, Lord, he hath 10 pounds. I say unto you that every one which has shall be given, and from him that hath not, even that he that shall be taken away from him. But those my enemies which I would not that I should reign over them, bring hither and slay them before me. So we find that the interpretation Jesus told a parable and about his goings to the Father to receive the kingdom. A certain nobleman, Christ is the nobleman, and he was born to be king, Luke 1, verse 32. So he went to a distant country, the distant far country is heaven, where he went when he ascended, Luke 24, verse 26. And to receive a kingdom for himself, he ascended to heaven after his resurrection, the Ancient of Days, his Father, to receive a kingdom. The kingdom to be received was the church. Daniel 7, 13, 14, and then Matthew 16, 18 through 19. And he returned, his return is the second coming, Acts chapter 1, verses 8 through 11. But his citizens hated him and said he would not, we will not, he says, have this man to reign over us. Jesus was rejected by his own people. Isaiah 53 pointed out to us, John 1, verse 11, also John 1 and John 19 and verse 5, verse 6. And so we see that taking place. And then when he returned, he called them into account. This represents the judgment of the Jewish nation and foreshadows the judgment of the world, Matthew 21, 41, and 2 Corinthians 5, 10, and 11. The judgment is the just and the wicked. The just are rewarded. The wicked are those who hated him and described him as enemies, and so they are to be slain before his eyes. 2 Thessalonians 2, 7 through 9. So this parable shows, number one, that Christ's kingdom was not established during his earthly reign, that it was not a kingdom on earth established after his return. So the passages, when we stop for a moment and think about the passages on the ascension, when did Christ go to the Ancient of Days? Well, let the Bible speak. Mark chapter 16, verse 19. So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken unto them, was received up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. Then in Luke 24, verse 50 through 51, and he led them out of as far as to Bethany, and he lifted up his hands and blessed them, and it came to pass, while he blessed them, he was parted from them and carried up into heaven. Then in Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. And when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel, which also said, You men of Galilee, why stand you gazing into heaven? The same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall so come in like manner as to see him go into heaven. Acts 1, 9 through 11. So when we stop and think on the day of Pentecost, when they preached the gospel in Acts chapter 2, beginning verse 29, the Bible there points out to us, he says this is a reading from the New King James Version, tells us there, it says, Brethren, I may say unto you freely of the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us unto this day, being therefore a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that as the fruit of his loins he would set one upon his throne. 2 Samuel 12 through 17, and also Psalm 132, verse 11 points that out. He foreseeing this spake of the resurrection of Christ, that neither was he left unto Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus has God raised up, whereof we all are witnesses. Being therefore by the right hand of God exalted, have received having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has poured forth this which you see and hear. For David ascended not into the heavens, but he saith unto himself, The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou on my right hand until I make thy enemies the footstool of thy feet. Psalm 110 and verse 1. So let all house, he goes on to say, of Israel therefore know assuredly that God hath made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. They had crucified the Lord. So when Jesus was resurrected, he showed himself alive, and after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of 40 days and speaking of these things pertaining to the kingdom of God, Acts 1 verse 30. So after this, Jesus ascended to the Ancient of Days, and there was given him dominion, glory, and a kingdom. He came to the Ancient of Days in heaven. The preeminence having come from the Ancient of Days to the earth to receive his kingdom. When one considers the Psalms, the prophecies, the parable, the ascension passage, and the preaching on Pentecost, he can have no doubt at the time of the coming fulfillment of that of Daniel's prophecy of the formation of Christ in Daniel 7, verses 1 through 14. Now, even between that of the Testament, since that is what we are studying, as we think about the Testaments and as we study about them, then we see that even though they had some ideas that are contrary to what the Bible says, it helps us to understand why the Jews believed what they believed when Jesus came and began to do the miracles that he did to prove that he was the Son of God, and yet they rejected him and killed him, and therefore the kingdom came as the prophets had prophesied. So the kingdom of God was established when Jesus came the first time in the days of his flesh, Mark 1:14 and 15, when he preached the good news of the kingdom. He told the men they must be born again to see it, John 3, verses 3 through 5, and was crucified according to the determinate counsel of and foreknowledge of God, Acts 2 and verse 23. Jehovah was not taken by surprise nor caught off guard. Jesus died and was buried and resurrected according to the scripture. Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4. Jesus is now reigning at the right hand of God, Acts 2 and verse 34. Many other passages like Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, and also chapter 8, verse 8, and also in chapter 8. So we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 24, and 28, many other passages that points that out. So when he comes the second time, Hebrews 9 and verse 28, it will be to deliver the kingdom back to the Father, 1 Corinthians 15, 22 through 28. And also Ephesians 5, verses 25 through 27. Premillennialism is absolutely wrong. There will never be another world empire like the four described in the vision of Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. The stone cut out of the mountain without hands saw to that. The kingdom of Christ is the only universal kingdom to exist on earth until the end of time. It is a spiritual kingdom. God never intended that it be political, physical, earthly kingdom as per the premillennial agenda. So when the disciples of John the Baptist and asked Jesus if he was really the Messiah, Jesus told them to check the evidence. And the same is true regarding the kingdom. The evidence demands that we accept the kingdom God has given and not be guilty of looking for another that the Bible knows nothing about. And yet, when we stop and look at that, because the reason why we are looking at it is because of our study between that of the Testaments and how that Daniel, as that of the prophet, of that of the Old Testament, points out to us in reference to these kingdoms, and how that also Daniel points out to us some of the events that took place between that of the Testament. But yet, the eternal purpose of God has been fulfilled in reference to that of the coming of the kingdom. When we stop and think about all of those things that we have read and studied between the Testament, and as we have coming to the conclusion of our studies, then there is a need for us to just wrap up, as they say sometimes, the things that we have learned, and maybe just go back for a few the rest of our time tonight as we conclude our study between that of the Testaments, that we talk about. Give an overview of what we actually have studied. And if you'll notice with me that we've talked about a number of things, and I really mean that it has been a number of things that we have talked about. And so, in order for us, as we began our study, in order for us to understand, um, have a working knowledge of the background of Bible history, uh, we need to be understand or have that of a history overview of that of the history to set the stage for the intertestament period of that of biblical history, and that's what we did because our lessons want to review again the narrative from Abraham to that of the Babylonian exile, and we can say that first of all that there was a call of Abraham, that is the beginning, God's promise to Abraham, a nation that is Israel, a land that is Canaan, and a seed which was Jesus the Christ. And so the call of Abraham is recorded in Genesis chapter 11, verses 26 to chapter 12, verse 7, and it is placed in the context of the moral depravity of that of the world. The narrative of the creation reached a crisis with the destruction of that of the world by the flood in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9. And then we find, however, the flood did not cure the problem of sin, as the Tower of Babel shows us that in Genesis chapter 11, beginning verse 1. Consequently, the Lord made a new beginning with the call of Abraham. So while loving while living in that of the Ur of Chaldees, we find that Abraham received a call from God to leave his father's house and to go to a land that God would show him. And so Abraham left. And therefore, God blessed him in reference to that, that there was three promises that was made to him to make him make from his descendants a great nation, and to give him the land of Canaan, and also to bless the whole world through that of his descendants in Genesis 12:1-7. So we had the part patriarchal age when you look at an overview of that of the Bible from around 2150 BC to 1850 BC. The Genesis narrative records about the lives of these three great patriarchs. That is, as we talk about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we talk about them in reference to what they were involved in reference to that of the promise that God had given to them. And so during that time, and how that God moved Israel to that of Egypt, where they lived in that of the land of Goshen, and separated from that of the Egyptians, and held them in abomination, so that they avoided that of racial intermingling, and so 70 people went into that of Egypt. And so then we had the Exodus in 1450 BC, where the children of Israel were in that of in Egypt for about 430 years, according to Acts 7 and verse 6 and Galatians 3 and verse 17. So they went to Egypt as a favored relatives of that of Joseph. And so the person who was second in command in Egypt, and so a change of dynasty resulted in their being reduced to slavery. Then you had where God called them out, because as they were there, we find that they were called out to go into the land of Canaan, and so they had the wilderness wanderings in 1450 to 1410 BC. Then they had the conquest of that of Canaan, 1410 to 1400 BC. There was the period of the Judges, 1400 to 1050 BC, and if you ever noticed that's like 350 years of Judges. And so you had Othniel and Ehud and Shamar and Deborah and Gideon, Abimelech and Tola and Jared, Jephthah and Isban and Elon and Abdon and Samson and Eli and that Samuel. And so then you had a united kingdom where Saul and David and Solomon reigned 40 years apiece. Because they were appointed king, the people wanted a king, and God gave them a king. And we find that the kingdom divided in 930 BC to 722 BC. The reason we say 722 BC because that's when the 10 northern tribes were taken into captivity. And so Judah is left alone from 722 BC to 586 BC. And we find that the reason for that is because of Judah will be carried off into Babylonian captivity, as we have expressed in our studies of Between the Testament, because here we're going to find that there is going to be, Daniel is going to tell us about the four different world kingdoms that we've already talked about. So they go into exile, and then they return. They 586, around 440 BC, they were returning and rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the walls. Yet we find that Daniel tells us, though, in reference to all of this, about Nebuchadnezzar's vision during that Babylonian captivity in Daniel chapter 2. If you recall there, that though it's a way that Daniel has pointed out to us in reference to that of the Nebuchadnezzar there, the head of gold referred to that of Babylon, then he had the arms of silver, which referred to the Medo-Persian kingdom, and then the thighs of brass referred to that of the Macedonian Greek Empire, that is Alexander the Great, and then we'd have that of the legs of iron and part of iron that's clay, and that would be help us to understand that would be the Roman Empire, began in 63 BC and ended in 776 BC. So with all of that, with the story of the Jews returning to the land of Israel, the Old Testament narrative comes to a close. And so Revelation ceases from the last Old Testament prophets until that of the coming of the New Testament era. The 440 years between the restoration of Israel and the birth of Jesus Christ is called the intertestament period. And that's what we have studied for the last 14 weeks. We have talked about this time in reference to between that of the Testaments, and where we've looked at the Apocrypha and the pseudographical writings of that are given to us that have been found. Many of them have been found, and partials have been found, and we've used that to show some things, so for some things. The development, it seems to be, that of the history that began with the Babylonian period and went all the way through to the time that Jesus was born here upon the earth. And we can look at the Apocrypha and the pseudographical writings, and in doing so, we learn much things about what we have learned, some things that were really in the eternal purpose of God. As we always try to say, before the foundation of the world, God had an eternal purpose, and then from the foundation of the world, that purpose began to be planned out. And so we go through the patriarchal age, and then we go through the Mosaic age, and here we are in the Mosaic age where they're following the laws that had been given to Moses, and yet we come down to that of the book of Daniel, and which we have looked at extensively in some ways in reference to the promises that was made by the eternal promise. So we talked about the Babylonian period, the rise of Babylon or the Babylonian Empire, and as we talked about that, we saw that when we look that there were four portions of that of the reporting of that of the Jewish people in around 606 BC under that of Jehoiakim. Daniel and his friends were brought to that of Babylon, and then 597 Jehoiakim and the elite of that of Judah. I think it's thousands of people that were brought unto that. Also to that of Babylon. Then in 587 BC, at the fall of the city of Jerusalem, many others were taken to that of Jerusalem. Then about 582 BC, 745 more people were also taken to Jerusalem. And so we have and a number of passages that would bring this out to us, that we have the Jews in that of exile. And as we think about there being in that of exile, then we would find that Palestine was the poor and destitute of that of the Jews who were left from the deportation, were left to occupy that of the land of Palestine. And these Jews suffered as their neighbors encroached on their lands, and particularly the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites. So throughout this period, Jerusalem laid in ruins, and the people struggled to exist. And so devout Israelites offered their sacrifices on the blackened ruins of that of the temple. And also there was Egypt. There, the group which left Israel and fled to Egypt settled in the delta area of the Nile, according to Jeremiah 43 and verse 7. And so Egypt hospitality received that of the Jews, and the Jewish mercenaries settled at Elephantine, and the first contract of that of the cataract of that of the Nile River in southern Egypt. And so here in that city and area, they constructed a temple, as we've talked about, after the model of the temple that was in Jerusalem. And so later, a flow of immigrants to Egypt made Egypt a center of the world for that of Jewish people, and especially is this in reference to that of Alexandria, Egypt, when we talked about that also. Now, Babylon was the elite people among the Jews. They were taken to that of Babylon, and there they preserved their culture. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 29, beginning verse 1, he instructed their deporters to settle down in Babylon and to live among the people where they were taken since they would be there for 70 years. Apparently, the exiles listened to Jeremiah, and so therefore they settled in Babylon. Those in Babylon achieved some measures of success, and the Bible points those things out. But despite all their prosperity in the land, the exile was a punishment for Israel's sins. And so the Babylonian Empire begins to crumble. Nebuchadnezzar was a very powerful ruler. However, the rulers who followed in his steps were relatively weak, and within a short time, the Babylon empire began to crumble. And in addition to his conquest of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar seized Tyre in around at 13th year of his siege, which ended with the Tyranian accomplishment of that of Babylonian sovereignty, but without the destruction of the city. So about 568, during the this time, the reign of Pharaoh Amasis, Nebuchadnezzar took advantage of the period of Egypt and its weaknesses and confused invade that of Egypt. So Nebuchadnezzar is known as a great leader, and after Nebuchadnezzar's death, he was succeeded by Marduk, known in the Bible as evil Merodach. Second Kings beginning verse 25, chapter 25, verse 27 beginning. He was a ruler who released Jehoiakim's prison and fed him at his table. And so evil Merodach was murdered by his brother-in-law near Lissar. He was generally accepted as Nergal Shalzar of Jeremiah 39 and verse 3. He had some success in the military leader, and he was succeeded by his son, Nabashai Marduk, who reigned for a few months before he was assassinated by Nabonidus. He was the last ruler of that of Babylon. So Babylon falls. And so the account of the fall of Babylon is found in that of the Cyrus cylinder that is an archaeological find and a propaganda document of the new ruler of Babylon. So the document refers to the former rulers of offering strange prayers to another god and things of that sort. So we find that the document goes on to tell how the populace welcomed Cyrus as their new leader and how beneficiary they benefited from the way that he was actually treated. And then we talked about that the Persian period around 539 to 332 BC, and that refers to the period of Israel's history during the time that she was under that of the subjection to that of the Persian rulers. So under that, we would find that the rulers there were Cyrus and Cambyses and Darius the first and Artaxerxes and Artaxerxes and Artaxerxes the first and Darius the second and Artaxerxes the second and Artaxerxes the third and Arces and Darius the third. So there's a lot of reference to Persian rulers that came upon the scene. And we looked at some of those, but all this was in that of preparing for that of the coming of that of between the testaments, where we would see a lot of things that developed there that we looked at. Israel, under that of the Persian rulers, Persia experienced a rapid rise to power after the brilliant leadership of Cyrus the Great. He was the son of Cambyses the first, and so a vassal king. So when Cyrus ascended to the throne, he consolidated all these various Persian tribes, and he began to plot the overthrow of Astyages. And so he aligned himself with Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, in 550 BC, and overthrew the Median Empire. And at this point, Nabonidus became afraid of Cyrus, and so Nabonidus made alliances with Amasis of Egypt and Croesus of Lydia and counter the threat. We would find that Cyrus took a different stance toward that of the things, and therefore he defeated them. But he also took a different stance toward local customs of worship than did the Babylonians. He had instigated a different foreign policy, as we would say, which treated the subjects or which treated subjectively to that of the nations as aliens rather than as that of conquered enemies. And so, whereas Nebuchadnezzar had looted the areas, we find that Cyrus encouraged the nation to preserve their own religious festivities. So that was a real difference between. So then the Bible, though, as we continue to look at that as trying to give ourselves a historical background, the Bible pictures harmonies very well with what is known from history that Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. And so the first return was took around about 538 BC, and this is according to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And we'd have to read, especially Ezra, and we would find that the first order of business for those who returned was to reinstitute, divine worship. And so they rebuilt the altar of the Lord in the temple mount and began to worship the Lord, as Ezra tells us. So this was done under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Jeshua, the high priest. Worship was begun in the seventh month of the first year of their return. The next step was to rebuild the temple. The foundation of the temple was laid 536 BC. That's about the time that Daniel writes the book of Daniel. And so the second month of the second year. Then Cambyses became the leader at the death of Cyrus, and he continued to expand the Persian empire. And so during his return from a campaign to Egypt, he learned that one of the persons there had seized the Persian throne, and in his absence claiming to be his brother, Smerdis. Cambyses died suddenly, but conflicting stories leave us really, we don't know what happened to him. But Darius, his staples, became the king. And so because chaos really followed after Cambyses had died, and so one of his officers, Darius I, assured own command of the army and marched to Persia, and numerous pretenders claimed the throne throughout the empire. But we would find that within 2 years, that Darius fought 19 battles against 9 different rivals, and he had established his authority. And so he became the ruler of their king. Xerxes the first came. And during this time, this is where the book of Esther comes in. Esther was a queen. And next we would have that of Artaxerxes the first becoming that of the king. And he was the last Persian ruler from that of the Old Testament history. He became a king after the commander of the palace guard assassinated his father. And so he became king. And then we find the second return, though, was taking place during that of the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. Ezra led a group of Israelites back to Judea in 458 BC. Then the third return in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, Nehemiah, the cupbearer of the king Artaxerxes, led a third group of Israelites back to that of Judea. And there is no record of the size of the group that which returned. However, it was motivated by the deplorable conditions in that of Judea. During the early reign of Artaxerxes, a group had tried to rebuild the city, but we would find that as they were trying to rebuild it, they were stopped by the neighboring opponents. So when Nehemiah heard of their problem, he was saddened and appealed to Artaxerxes to allow him to return. And so in 444 BC, he came to Jerusalem and led the inhabitants in rebuilding the walls of the city. And you know the story about Sanballat and the Samaria, and also that of Tobiah, and how that they tried to stop the work, and yet we find that Nehemiah was actually successful in that. The book of Malachi serves something after sometime after the temple had been rebuilt, but we are really unable to determine specifically what years he served as God's prophet to that of the returned people, but he did during this time. Then we have, because now we go into, as we have done for a number of weeks, we talked about the invasion of that of the Greeks and the things that took place at that time. And so we would find that during the years of the Persian dominance, that Persia rulers extended their rule to the east side of the Aegean Sea with the hope of spreading westward to conquer the Grecian city-states. And so Darius I was defeated in battle. And so we would find that he captured, that is, as Darius the First, well, like I said, was defeated, and Xerxes crossed the Hellespont and moved with a huge army into that of the Macedonia and overwhelmed the defense that was there. And so, with the threat of that of Persians to the east, the circumstances for the Greeks was tenuous. Their city-state organization, with the intense rivalries, were being confronted by the armies too larger for their political system to overcome. So their survival depended upon their ability actually to organize their contentious city-states into a political alliance and able to withstand anything that would come toward them in reference to the enemies. In this contest, Philip of Macedonia uh, began building his military in Macedonia in northern Greece. The southern city states did not perceive him to be a threat. He became a threat. And the movement to bring all of the Grecian under one head might have failed had Philip's successor had been some ordinary person, but he wasn't. He was Alexander the Great. And so we studied and read a lot and spoke a lot about what all Alexander the Great has done in reference to that and the things that took place during the reign of that of Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander's influence outlasted his military conquest. He was educated by Aristotle, and he had a genuine love for that of all things Greek. And his military conquests were a means of spreading Grecian culture, which was very important to that of the eternal purpose of God, because of the Koine Greek language became the language of the world. So the Bible helps us upon that of the death of Alexander, the empire fell apart with no legitimate heir to the throne. The kingdom was eventually divided into four parts, as we made reference to. And in doing so, we find that the Grecian Empire is the third world empire depicted in Nebuchadnezzar's dream and mentioned later in the book of Daniel. We've talked about that with the historical backgrounds given. And so we talked about a lot of that. In Daniel chapter 2, we talked about in our last week, Daniel 2, the Grecian Empire is described as a third kingdom inferior to D. So the Babylonian Empire was under Nebuchadnezzar. It is represented by the brass belly and the legs of Nebuchadnezzar's image and is said to rule over all the earth, chapter 2 and verse 39. In chapter 7, Daniel sees another vision in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, around 556 BC, I am told, assuming that Belshazzar and Nabonidus reign are a contemporary throughout. Belshazzar may have been appointed some years later after that of Nabonidus' reign. But Daniel sees four beasts coming up out of the sea and representing the four kingdoms to that of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The first was like a lion and represented Babylon. The second one's, as we pointed out, was like a bear and represented the Medo-Persian Empire. The third was like a leopard and represented the Macedonian or Greek Empire. Then regarding the third empire, Daniel writes, after this, he says, I beheld, and to another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it four wings of a fowl of beast, and had four heads, and dominion was given to it. Chapter 7, verse 6. So the four wings of a fowl seem to signify the rapid movement with which Alexander's empire spread, and the fourth represents the division of his kingdom into the four parts upon his death. And so the Bible tells us or talks to us in reference to that of the Grecian Empire. And further, we would find if we were to take the time, and we've done this, I think, before we read Daniel chapter 8, verses 2 through 8, and about information concerning these kingdoms and in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, Daniel sees another vision. That is Daniel chapter 2, chapter 8, verses 2 through 8. He also gives verses 18 through 22 a interpretation of the vision, and he foretells there the victory of Greece over that of the Medo-Persian Empire. Daniel chapter 11 also describes the defeat of that of the Persians and the subsequent fortune of that of the Grecian Empire. So we look at all of that. So we stop and ask ourselves, or we maybe we wonder about some things. What about Israel at this time? All the time, at the time of the Grecian conquest, the Near East, Israel existed in three important parts of the world. They were in the land of Palestine, and also they were in Babylon, and then they were in Egypt. So these were the areas in which they were, and things were taking place in those areas in reference to the things that were being developed for the eternal purpose of God. But yet we talked some about the Ptolemies. Here is Israel. I mean, we talked about Palestine and other places, but the history in reference to Egypt, the Ptolemies, is very important because it starts in 323 and ends in 198 BC. So Alexander the Great had conquered most of the known world of the day, but he died in 323 unexpectedly, and he was just, as we said, age 33, and he did not leave an heir, and so they divided his kingdom up into with the four generals, and number one was the Ptolemy. Uh, Ptolemy Lagus would be Egypt, and Seleucus the first would be that of Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor, and Syria, and Lysimachus and Antigonus, they got Thrace and that of Phrygia, and Antipater got Pamphylia and uh, Lycia and Greater Phrygia. Now, when you look at those, and if you were to stop, and if we were to do as we did in our some of our other studies, we would run over to Acts chapter 2, verses 5 through 10 there, and we'd see that some of these places are mentioned, and there's a reason for that. That was because of the dispersion of that of the Jewish people into all these different areas. So, but one of the biggest areas was that of Egypt. And so these generals fought among themselves for supremacy, and the unity of the empire was completely lost. And so, after a period of 40 years, I believe it was, that the families of the generals, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids and that of Assyria, that had acquired control of the Near East. And so, of the four leaders, only the Ptolemies and Seleucids affected the Jewish nation directly. The Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in Syria fought over Palestine and so, of that area. And so the period of this struggle between that of the Ptolemies and Seleucid was a turbulent era for that of Israel, in the sense that see a lot of things that was taking place in reference to the different rulers that would take place of those two different kingdoms. The conflict between the two dynasty continued for hundreds of years. That is from 301 BC to all the way to 198 BC. That really brings us into the time of the between that of the Testaments and leading us into the Maccabean period, where most people talks about the between the Testaments. Under the Ptolemies, many Jews moved to Egypt, and we talked about that extensively. They went to Alexandria, and there's a lot of discussion about what went on there and how that they became part of the as a citizen of Alexandria. But there was the Hellenization of that of the Jewish people, the influence of Greek wars, and without being minimal, had it not been accompanied by the policy of Hellenization, that is, bringing the Greek culture to the conquered world. And so we have evidences of how that the situation had become from some of the apocryphal and pseudographical books that we've read. We read from the book of Jubilees, and I'll read from them. And in Jubilees, chapter 15, verse 33 to 34, this is what it says, and this is a second century writer, and he says there, and now I shall announce to you that the sons of Israel deny this ordinance, that is circumcision, and they will not circumcise their sons according to all of the law, because some of the flesh of their circumcision they will leave to the circumcision of their sons. And all the sons of Belair will leave their sons without circumcising, just as they were born. A great wrath from the Lord will be upon the sons of Israel, because they have left his covenant and have turned aside from his words, and they have provoked and blasphemed, inasmuch as they have done the ordinance of this law, because they have made themselves like the Gentiles, to be removed and be uprooted from the land, There is therefore for them no forgiveness or pardon, so that they might be pardoned and forgiven from all the sins of this eternal era. Now, when you read that, we have to always remember that when we're reading from the apocryphal, or we're reading from that of the pseudographical writings, that they're not inspired of that of God. They're more historical than anything else. And I've tried to point that across the whole time that we've gone through, because we've read different parts of all these different books to point out some of the things that were developing among that of the Jewish people, some of the thoughts that they had, and those thoughts were a lot of those thoughts were error. And also the writer of the first Maccabees, this is around 100 BC, chapter 1 there, beginning verse 11. He says, at that time there emerged in Israel a group of renegade Jews who invaded many by saying, we should go and make an agreement with the Gentiles round about. No, nothing but disaster has been our lot since we cut ourselves off from them. This proposal was widely approved, and some of the people, in their enthusiasm, went to the king and received authority to introduce pagan laws and customs. They built a gymnasium in the Gentile style at Jerusalem. They removed their remarks of circumcision and repudiated the Holy Covenant. They intermarried with the Gentiles and sold themselves to evil. So that's what First Maccabees chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. Now, the author of Second Maccabees, around 124 BC, says regarding the changes that the high priest Jason brought about in Jerusalem. Now, we have to remember that they're writing about these things, and they're telling us from a historical standpoint that these things took place. And so he writes, and he says he abolished the institutions found on the law and the introduced practices which ran counter to it. He lost no time in establishing a gymnasium at the foot of the Cynthia itself, and he made the most outstanding of the young men adopt the hat worn by Greek athletes. So with the introduction of foreign customs, Hellenism reached a high point through the inordinate weakness of Jason and apostate and no true high priest. As a result, the priests no longer showed any enthusiasm for their duties at the altar. They treated the temple with disdain. They neglected the sacrifice, wherein the opening gong called them that hurried to join in the sport at the wrestling school in defiance of the law. They placed no value on dignities prized by their forefathers, but cared about everything for Hellenic honors. So they had turned all away from that. Even Josephus would point out to us in the antiquities of the Jews, we find that he points out that the Jewish way of living, according to him, and to follow the king's laws and the Grecian way of living, wherefore they desired his permission to build them a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And when he had given them leave, they also hid the circumcision of their Gentiles and even Gentiles. And even when they were naked, they might appear to be Greeks. And accordingly, they left off all the customs and belonged to their own country and imitated the practices of other nations. The very fact that a Jewish translation of the Old Testament was needed is testimony that the Jews were losing their ability to speak that of Hebrew and adopting that of the Hellenistic way of life. That the apocryphal books, such as Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, and others, show that the influence of the Hellenistic thinking in Judaism, even Philo of Alexandria, for example, was thoroughly immersed in Hellenism. So during this period, Jerusalem now was treated as a vassal state, with the high priest being the chief political figure. And as a result of the high priest becoming a political figure, then the high priest's office became a political religious office with politicians vying to obtain the office. And so the high priest became responsible for tax collection for the ruling powers. We've talked a lot about Onassis. Onassis II withheld taxes from Ptolemy, and he lost his franchise to his nephew, Joseph ben Tobit, probably a descendant of Tobiah, who vied for the power of Nehemiah. But in 174 BC, we find that the rivals for the high priest questioned the Seleucid loyalties of Onias III, and Antiochus IV disposed of him and put his brother Jason in power as a high priest. Now, this intervention marked the beginning of the period when the traditional hereditary nature of high priesthood was set aside, and the Seleucid and the regular Roman rulers saw it as their right to appoint high priest. So the question would come up, it seems to me, where's the Bible? Why aren't they reading the Old Testament? Well, again, they as were losing the Hebrew and Aramaic language, they had turned to that of the Greek language. So one of the primary sources of information about the periods of Israel's history is that of the book of Daniel. In chapter 8, we find he describes this period, and he tells us in verses 1 through 4 of that, and describes the time of the Medo-Persian Empire under the figure of a ram with two horns. Then verses 5 through 7, he describes the conquest of the Persians by Alexander the Great under the figure of a rough he-goat. Now, we've already read that text, and I'm not going to, in our studies, and I'm not going to read it again today or tonight. The statement that the he-goat's great horn broken actually describes the death of Alexander, and the statement that four horns rise up is in his place describes the division of the kingdom into four parts. And so the prophecy that out of them, that is these four, out of them, there would grow one horn who fits his eyes against the fairest of all the lands, and he will stop the worship of the temple and throw down the sanctuary, is fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes, who cast the true religion to that of the ground. And we're going to talk about him again because he's very important in that of the history between that of the Testaments, and that of Malachi, and to that of the time of Christ, Mark, Luke, and John. And so Daniel 11 also helps us in the period. We didn't read that one during our studies of looking at that in Daniel, but in verses 2 and 3 there, he describes the Persian-Greek conflict ended in the conquest of Alexander the Great. His kingdom divided into those four parts. He mentions that. And so verses 5 through 44 gives a detailed prophecy of what shall occur in the conflict between the Ptolemies and Seleucids, and ultimately with the Maccabeans, who was the independence of the Jews from that of Seleucid domination. Now, it's interesting because when you look at that, here's the history that is being given to us in reference to that of Daniel prophesying what's going to take place, and it actually takes place. And the writers of the Apocrypha and the writers of the pseudographic points all these things out, plus things that we find in that of archaeology discoveries that. But then it comes because we talk about the between the testaments, and again, like I would say, it would be good for us maybe sometime to sit down and read the Maccabees, the first and second Maccabees, third Maccabees. I don't think so, but you can read it too. But especially the first and second Maccabean uh, uh, writings would be the Syrian rule during this time of the Maccabean period was 198 to 143 BC, and Articius the third. And we call him Articius III, and then also some people, when they write about him, Articius the Great, 223 to 187 BC. He successfully drove the Ptolemies out of Palestine. And so he was welcomed by the Jewish citizens because of the abuses of that of the Ptolemies had been guilty of. But the problem was that Antiochus III had expansionist ideas that brought him into conflict with the new power in the West, that is Rome. And we didn't spend a lot of time in talking about that, but we did bring it up a number of times in reference to how that they were having this problem. His efforts to conquest or conquer that of Egypt was stopped by or slowed down by that of the Romans. Scarcely had Antiochus III brought Seleucid power to its greatest height when he overreached himself. And he dared to measure swords with that of Rome. And we brought that out, I think, after a few weeks of our beginning of our study. Rome had just finished crushing Carthage at Zama in 202 BC. And the people there, the general Hannibal, had fled to the Seleucian court, hoping there to continue the struggle at his best, but partly because at Hannibal's encouragement, partly the behest of his own ambition, he saw himself as the arbiter of that of Greek affairs, both in Asia and in Europe. And Antiochus advanced into Greece, and Rome thereupon declared war in 192 BC, quickly drove Antiochus from that of Europe and followed him into Asia in 190, and at Magnesia between Sardis and Smyrna, according to Daniel 11 and verse 18, administered him a shattering defeat. So Antiochus was then obliged to submit to the humiliation peace of that Apamia, and the terms of which required him to yield all Asia Minor, save Cilicia, to surrender his war elephants and his navy, to hand over that of Hannibal and other refuge to that of the Romans. And so, together with 20 hostages, including his own son, later ruled as Antiochus IV, and to pay an enormous indemnity, Hannibal fled for his life. The other terms were enforced originally, and Antiochus III did not long survive his disgrace. In 187 BC, he was killed while robbing a temple in Elam to get money to pay the Romans. Daniel 11 and verse 19. So you have Seleucid the fourth, 187 to 175 BC, and he succeeded Antiochus III, and he sent Herodias, Herodorus, an exactor, to collect funds due to that of Rome to Jerusalem. And Seleucus IV was eventually assassinated by Herodorus. And Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, 175 to 164 BC, became the next monarch. Now, what is said about him is that Antiochus IV, who from personal experience had a healthy respect for that of Rome, felt a desperate need to actually unify his people for the defense of the reign, reign that he would reign, while his financial plight led him to covet whatever sources of revenue that he could find. So, like his predecessors, he had the wealth of various temples within his dominion, certain of which he is known to have plundered in the course of his reign. So the temple of Jerusalem would scarcely escape his attention. At the Fairmount Church of Christ, where I preach on Sundays and teach a class, we're studying the Book of Kings. And in studying the Book of Kings, we have seen Solomon build a temple. And one of the comments that was made, you could see how that anybody that would see it and how that it was so overlaid with that of gold, how that they would know that it was very costly, and that if they could get their hands on all of the things within it, the gold, the silver, then they could be wealthy people. And so we see what's taking place. Needing those funds to pay Rome, Antiochus IV sold the office of the high priest to the highest bidder. All parties curried the favor of the Syrian ruler, and he naturally listened to the one who promised the greatest compliance with his will and the most money. So in 174 BC, the rivals for the priesthood questioned the loyalty of Onias III to the Seleucid, and he was removed from office, and his brother Jason was put in place, as we've already said. So this intervention marked the beginning of a period when the traditionally hereditary nature of the high priesthood was just set aside. It didn't have to be according to what the Bible said. And the Seleucid and the later Roman rulers saw it at their right, actually, to appoint these priests. Since Jason was aggressively Hellenistic, that is, he's born in the Greek culture, his appointment outraged the people of Judea. And 3 years later, he was replaced by Menelaus, who was not a descendant of the family of Aaron. And when Menelaus offered a larger bribe than Jason, however, the people rejected him and rioted, erupted. Menelaus' most significant qualification was that he offered Antiochus IV a larger bribe than Jason. 2 Maccabees chapter 4, beginning verse 23. Around 169 BC, Ptolemy VI declared war on Antiochus IV, but he was defeated. And in the late summer of the fall of 169, Menelaus allowed Antiochus, returning from his first Egyptian campaign, plunder the temple of all of its treasures, even stripping the gold plating from its facade. 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 20, and 2 Maccabees chapter 5, beginning verse 15. The author of Maccabees, 1 Maccabees, he puts it this way. He says, in his arrogance, he entered the temple and carried off the gold altar, the lampstand with all its fittings, the table of bread of presence, libation cups, bowls, and the gold censers, the curtain, and the garland. He stripped the gold plating from the front of the temple, seized the silver and the gold, the precious vessels, and whatever secret treasures he found, and carried them all away when he left for his own country. That was in 1 Maccabees. Now, 2 Maccabees adds this. He says, not satisfied with this and guided by Menelaus,
who had turned traitor to both religion and country, the king had the audacity to enter the most temple on earth. The villain laid his polluted hands on the sacred vessels, and profanity swept upon the votive offerings which other kings had made to enhance the splendor and the fame of the shrine. Chapter 5 of your. So in 168 BC, in his second expedition against Egypt, rumor spread that Antiochus IV had been killed. The supposed high priest Jason used the occasion to reclaim the priesthood. Menelaus, the fighting which ensued forced Menelaus to seek refuge in Acre, the newly established Greek citadel of Jerusalem. And however, though Antiochus IV was not dead, it was just as we said that of a rumor that he had died. And so at this time, Rome, who had become influential, a very influential player in international politics, sent a senatorial embassy um, to Egypt, ordering Antiochus out of Egypt. Recognizing the power of Rome and fearing becoming Rome's enemy, Antiochus withdrew from Egypt. Antiochus IV interpreted Jason's conduct in trying to regain the priesthood as rebellion against Syrian law. And so he unleashed his armies on Jerusalem. And in 167 BC, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, as we call it, that's the way I pronounce that. Some people say it's Epiphanes. So they sent Apollonius to Jerusalem to punish those who were acting in the rebellion. Now, Second Maccabees chapter 5 describes the event. It says this. He says he took Jerusalem by storm, ordering his troops to cut down unsparingly everyone they met, to slaughter those who refused took refuge in houses. Young and old were murdered. Women and children massacred. Girls and infants butchered. At the end of 3 days, the victims numbered 80,000. 40,000 killed in fighting, and so many again sold into slavery. So he entered Jerusalem on the Sabbath and slaughtered her unresisting citizens. And so after the slaughter, Jerusalem was fortified as a Syrian city. So in efforts to unify the kingdom, Antiochus IV tried to force Hellenism on the Jews. Now, again, when we read the Maccabees, First Maccabees chapter 1, beginning verse 41, the king issued an edict throughout his empire. His subjects were all to become one people and abandon their own customs. Everywhere the nation complied with the royal command, and many in Israel willingly adopted the foreign cult, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. Antiochus sent an early Athenian to compel the Jews to give up their ancestral customs and to cease regulating their lives by the law of God. He was commissioned also to pollute the temple of Jerusalem and dedicate it to the Olympian Zeus, the sanctuary of Mount Gerizim. He was to dedicate to Zeus, god of hospitality, as requested by the local inhabitants. Second Maccabees chapter 6, beginning verse 1. So Antiochus IV thus reversed a policy of tolerance toward that of Jewish religion and sought to make her accepted that of Hellenistic ways. Also, we would find that if you were to go back to First Maccabees in chapter 1, beginning verse 45, it had said there, whole offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings were forbidden in the temple. Sabbaths, feast days were to be profaned. The temple and its ministers defiled. Pagans' altars and idols and sacred precincts were to be established. Swine and other unclean beasts to be offered in sacrifice. The Jews were to leave their sons uncircumcised. They had to make themselves in every way abominable, unclean, profane, and to forget the law and changed all their statutes. The penalty for disobeying the royal command was death. Such were the terms of the edict issued by the king throughout his reign. So the Hellenistic Jews supported the policies of Antiochus IV, according to First Maccabees 1, verse 52. And so they built the gymnasium in the city of Jerusalem, and those participants exercised in the nude, and they had operations to remove the marks of circumcision, and many intermarried with that of the Gentiles. Despite all the persecution, many in Judea resisted Antiochus as the force oppression, and those who opposed the Hellenization banded together under the name of Hasidim, that is the pious ones, who were forerunners to the Pharisees and the Essenes. And the Hasidim were not a political group, but pious religious people. So then you have, as we called it, and as we were closing our studies, that we had the Maccabean rebellion. So it reached a critical point around 167 BC when the Hasmonean, a priest named Mattathias, who we mentioned a number of times, was being forced to offer a sacrifice on a pagan altar. He refused to do that. The officers tried to compel the elderly priest to offer the sacrifice, but Mattathias refused, and when he refused, another Jew stepped forward to offer the sacrifice. And so this was the beginning of the Maccabean rebellion against Syrian rule. Mattathias had 5 sons: John, Simeon, Judas, and Eleazar, and Jonathan, each of whom became leaders in the rebellion. And they much is said in reference to them. Some Jews who had decided to leave according to the Mosaic law withdrew in the desert to live. And Antiochus sent forces to destroy them, and they attacked on the Sabbath when the Jews would not resist and killed all of them. So as a result of that slaughter, the Maccabeans decided that the law did not prevent fighting in self-defense on the Sabbath. So the Hasidim joined forces with the Maccabees to withstand the Syrians. Maccabees 142. So Mattathias and his friends swept through the countryside. They were using, as we would call it, guerrilla tactics to tear down pagan altars and forcibly circumcise all Jewish boys and attack apostate Jews. Chapter 2 of First Maccabees. And upon the death of Mattathias, we find his son Judas became the leader of the resistance. And the Syrians, though, they underestimated Judas. He reigned 166 to 161 BC. Antiochus during that time was occupied with a campaign against the Parthians, leaving his regent Lysias to fight against the Maccabees, but the Maccabees successfully resisted their attacks. And so using guerrilla tactics, Judas defeated the Syrians under Apollonius, the one who had led the massacre in 167 BC. He also defeated a local commander named Siron. And in the fall of 165, Licinius entered negotiations with Judas, and perhaps influenced by that of the Roman presence and the pressure that was put upon them, which ended the persecution of Judaism. And around December 165, we're told that Judas and his family went to Jerusalem to cleanse the temple on the very day it had been profaned by Antiochus Epiphanes 3 years earlier. And the relighting of the monarch is commemorated in the annual celebration of Hanukkah, called the Feast of Dedication, which we find in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the book of God, sometimes called the Feast of Lights. At some point during the struggle, the goals of Judah and his party changed. He was no longer fighting for religious liberty, but for political independence. The War of Independence lasted from 165 to 143 BC. So after the death now of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, Antiochus V, and they called him Eupator, 164 to 162, became king. And the change in leadership, though, caused Judas to think he could solidify his position, but some miscalculations forced him to accept terms of peace with Antiochus V. So in 162, 161, Demetrius the first soldier escaped from the Romans and ordered the assassination Lysias and Antiochus Antiochus V, and after which he became king. And so factions among the Jews courted his favor, created dissension among those revolted against the Syrian rule. So Judas asserted his control over Judea and sent ambassadors to Rome to conquest and to request an alliance against Demetrius. And so Rome was happy to accommodate him and signed a treaty with him in 161 BC. So Demetrius responded, though, by attacking Judas, and in the ensuing battle, Judas was killed. For several years, each of the Maccabean sons were killed in battle, but during this period, the Jews established themselves successfully or sufficiently to keep the Syrians at bay. And so Jonathan, Maccabees, secured peace for about 5 years, and Alexander the first, Balus, led a revolution against Demetrius the first Soter, and he, with Demetrius and Alexander the first, both needing support and help in that of the civil war, Jonathan was able to play one against the other, resulting in Balus officially appointing Jonathan governor of Judea. So, as the final figure in the heroic battle for freedom, Simon was also the first in line of kings, and so the Hasmonean dynasty. So Simon died in the hands of his own son-in-law, and with his death, the Maccabean period ended, and the Hasmonean period begins. So the Bible speaks of the Maccabean period and the prophecies that occurred in Daniel chapter 8, beginning verse 9, and also in Daniel chapter 11. A full knowledge of the Maccabean period is essential, really, to understanding that of Daniel chapter 11. So that, again, it helps us because of our studies of that between the Testament. And so we can see that it does help to study this between the Testament. Now, on to that of the Hasmoneans, and we spent some time with them because it's around 135 to 63 BC. And mine's not failing me, once 63 BC, the Roman Empire annually prophesied. So the Hasmoneans or Asmoneans refers to a priestly family of the Maccabeans. So the term is probably taken from the names of one of the ancestors of the Maccabees. It refers to those who were descendants of that of Simon Maccabees, who moved from 143 to 63 BC. In September 141 BC, the nation of Judah conferred on Simon and his descendants the legitimate and permanent authority as high priest. And so it began the Hasmonean dynasty. And so Simon was assassinated in 135 BC by his son-in-law, Ptolemy, who was the governor of Jericho. And so then we had come up with, we talked a lot about John Hyrcanus, 135 to 104 BC. They have found coins with the reign of John Hyrcanus the second. The archaeologists have, but he succeeded his father, but was unable to punish Ptolemy because he held his mother hostage. And we talked some about that. One writer tells us, in reference to that of the Hyrcanus' rule, says the Hasmoneans had progressed from the attainment of religious freedom to the elimination of the high priesthood aristocracy, to political independence, and after some attempts by Jonathan and Simon were limited results to conquer under that of Hyrcanus. And so his successes, as we think about his successes, were tempered by conflicts which erupted with that of the Pharisees. So rumors spread that he had looted David's temple to pay the mercenaries to his army. As a result of this, the Pharisees withdrew their support, and the Pharisee named Eleazar challenged John's right to priesthood. And as a result from that, we find that John Hyrcanus shifted his support to that of the Sadducees and began to strive between the two sects. And so, after the same time, the Essenes withdrew into the desert, so including that of the community of the Quran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So then you have Aristobulus' brief reign, the 104 to 103, a little over a year, is significant because he was the first Hasmonean to take the title king. Then Alexander Jannaeus, 103 to 76 BC, the widow of Aristobulus, Simone Alexander, released Aristobulus' brother from prison and subsequently married Alexander Jannaeus, who was 13 years younger than her. And Alexander continued the expansionist policy of John Hyrcanus during the first 15 years of his reign. So Alexander invaded different areas, and therefore his army was completely destroyed by the Nabateans. When he returned to his own country, he began a 6-year civil war designed to overthrow the government. And so during the war, 50,000 Jews were killed. So ironically, the Pharisees resorted to Demetrius III, a solution to overthrow Alexander, a descendant of the Maccabees. And so Demetrius was victorious in the battle, but the Jewish citizens saw the defeated king wandering as a fugitive in the wilderness, and they rallied to Janus, and he reasserted his power upon securing his position. Janus attacked the Pharisees, said that he had 800 Pharisees crucified before him and had their wives and children killed before them as they died. So Janus immoral lifestyle brought physical ailments, which lasted for 3 years before the causing of the deaths. And so we find that Aristobulus, 67 to 63, upon the death of Salome, Hyrcanus was appointed to the high priest and the king. Within 3 months, the two brothers Hyrcanus and Aristobulus came into conflict in the civil war, which lasted until 63 BC when Judah was annexed by the Romans. That brings us into the Roman period, 63 BC to AD 125. That's a period of time. So early Roman history is concealed behind the myth of Romulus and Remus, two legendary orphaned infants who were supposedly raised by a wolf. Rome was probably ruled as a city-state from 753 to 509 BC. The early Republic period of Roman dynasty or history, 509 to 280 BC, marks the time when the king was disposed. Rome was ruled by two annually elected councils and Senate, a legislative body of aristocrat men who by law had to be millionaires. During this period, the Roman Republic expands to cover all of Italy. The Middle Republic, years of 280 to 133 BC, Rome was expanded its empire to include that of the Western Mediterranean in the Punic Wars. And so against that of Carthage, defeated the armies of Hannibal, and also the Macedonian Wars against the Hellenistic kingdoms. And so the Punic Wars ended in 146 BC when Carthage was completely defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus. The later Republic years, 133 to 49 BC, are characterized by foreign wars of expansion, most signifying the mark by Ptolemy conquering the Seleucid Empire in 67 BC. Also, a slave revolt led by the gladiator named Spartacus ravaged Italy. I can recall in my younger years when I was a teenager, there was a movie about Spartacus. And I can't remember, I can see the face of the man who played it, but I can't remember his name. Victor, I think was his name. Victor something other. But we watched many movies about things like this. When I was growing up, they were shown at theaters. We got to go see those. But Sparta, he ravaged Italy. And so the revolt took 3 years to surpass, 73 to 71. But in 60, in 60 BC, three military strongmen called Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus met to form the first triumvirate to overthrow the Senate. And Julius Caesar's successful war against Gaul gave him greater power. So the civil wars are those years from 49 to 27 BC when Rome had internal struggles to determine whether it would have senatorial or monarchical rule. And Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and attacked the other members of the triumvirate, Pompey and Crassus. And in the end, Julius Caesar was the victor. On March the 15th, 44 BC, he was assassinated, leading to the further civil wars. And a second triumvirate that was formed of Octavian Caesar, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. So Octavian and Anthony turned against each other, and in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian defeated Anthony and Cleopatra to become sole master of the Roman world. So the Senate conferred on him the title of Augustus. So from 31 BC to AD 235, Rome was ruled by an emperor. Then there was the rise, though, of Antipater, after Pompey captured the Seleucid kingdom, he appointed Sarkis as governor of Syria, and Sarkis secured control over Palestine and appointed Hyrcanus II as ethnarch. And then the appointment was a reward for his non-resistance to Roman rule. So Hyrcanus ruled as high priest and ethnarch, 63 to 40. And but Antipater was the real power behind the throne. Antipater endeared himself to Rome by assisting Rome in its series of revolts. So Antipater was able to maneuver successfully the political landscape during the civil war between Antony and that of Julius Caesar. So he uh, endeared himself to Julius Caesar by helping those in Pergamon, an ally of Caesar, to cross the Sinaitical desert and enter in that of Egypt. And Caesar left Hyrcanus as ethnarch and high priest, but made Antipater a Roman citizen and procurator over Judea. So that was a rise in there. And so we find a number of things, but again, things that took place. But Caesar was assassinated, and by Brutus and Cassius, and Antony took up the task of punishing them. And the second triumvirate was formed Octavian, Antiochus, and Lepidus. Uh, uh, find that after the assassins of Julius Caesar were punished, triumvirate turned on each other, and during the next several years, while the wars between Octavian and Anthony occurred, the Parthians captured Syria and made Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, second high priest and king, and Hyrcanus was subjected to that indignity of having his ears bitten off so that he could never again hold office of a high priest. And so Pharisee committed suicide, and Herod fled to Masada, where he left his family while he went to Rome through that of Egypt for that of help. So in 40 BC, the Romans appointed Herod as king over that of Palestine. So then that actually begins the Roman period, 63 BC to AD 125. And so the rule there first was that of Herod the Great, if you recall, 37 BC, 37 to 4 BC. And so he became the king in 40 BC, but he fought for 3 years before he actually got control. Say that it's 37. His family life was chaotic. He married Mary Anna, Emily, a member of the Hasmonean dynasty, whom he loved intensely. We talked a lot about that relationship earlier on in our studies of the New Testament, but there was a division in reference to that of Herod's great kingdom. Herod's death, his kingdom was divided into three different sections. Archelaus, Judea. Archelaus got Judea and Samaria and Idumea. Herod Antipas got Galilee and Perea. Herod Philip, the district east and northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Archelaus would later have become king had he ruled wisely. But he was such a tyrant as a ruler that a disposition of the Jews went to Rome and requested that he be removed from office and Roman be put in his place. Now, Archelaus was banished to Gaul in 86. Judea became a Roman province under procurators, and so after Judah was made a province, the capital moved to Caesarea, to that of the coast, and so the nature of the rule of the procurators differed from the general procurators, showing difference from Jewish beliefs and those that allowed them to practice freedom. Had Herod Antipas from 4 BC to AD 36, Herod Philip 4 BC to AD 34. Then you have, as you stop and look at them, there are some other rulers that took place. The emperors, Augustus 27 BC to AD 14, Tiberius 14 to 37 AD, and also you have Gaius Caligula 37-41, and Claudius 41-54, and Nero 54 and 68. Now during that time, after Nero 68, because of him, find that he killed his wife and caused his mother to be assassinated. And so we would find that the Jews began to rebel, and it began around 66. Nero appointed Vespasian to put them down. But upon the death of that of Nero, Galba, Ortho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, that's all between that of 68 to that of 79. These four leaders took place. Finally, Vespasian secured the throne and reordered peace, and he had two sons, Titus and Domitian, were the Flavian dynasty. And Vespasian appointed his son Titus to replace him and putting down the Jewish rebellion. In 70, the city of Jerusalem fell and the temple was destroyed. A small group of holdouts fled to Masada, where they were defeated in 73 AD. And so then you had Titus 79 to 81, Domitian 81 to 96, Nerva 96 to 98, and Trajan 98 to 117, and Hadrian 117 to 138. And then the Roman rule in Palestine around 135 after the death of that of the rulers who were in office during the lifetime of Jesus. All of Palestine was ruled for a few years by another monarch serving as a vassal under Rome. His name was Herod Agrippa I, 41 to 44. And so Herod Agrippa was brought to Rome living in luxury. So traffic living left him deeply in debt and forcing him to flee to the city to escape his creditors. So he fled to a remote place on the southern fringe of Judea. And if you recall, some of the things that's talked about that of Agrippa, has been best remembered by Bible readers for his execution of James in prison, that of Peter in Acts chapter 12. Then you had some Herod Agrippa the second. He was about 44 to 100 AD. When Agrippa first died, Claudius did not immediately appoint someone. Uh, so Agrippa the second was 17 years old. And so 4 years later, in 48, Claudius gave Agrippa the second rule of the small kingdom of Chalcedon in the area of Lebanon. And then in 50, Agrippa changed his dominion from that, what had been that of Philip, an adjacent territory east of the Sea of Galilee and upper that of Jordan. And later, Nero extended his dominion to include parts of Galilee and Perea and the city of Judas, and Agrippa II made Caesarea Philippi his capital. Then you had some later ones, Fatus, Tiberius, Alexander, Cumulus, and Felix, if you remember Felix and Festus. And then also Albinus, 62 64, Florian, 66 66, and then we had the Jewish War, 66 and 70. And so the Jewish love for its independence and freedom was a contributing factor to that of the Jewish War. Messianic hope that God would send a Messiah who would deliver them from that of Roman oppression, fed the idealism of zealous, that of the zealots. Sporadic conflicts occurred, which were reactions to the Roman administration mistakes they had made. And so the Maccabeans' heritage encouraged zealots to think they could be victorious over the Roman forces. That would not be so. And so mounting dissatisfaction with the Roman procurators and the weakness of Nero's administration in his latter years led these zealots to think that they could be victorious if they rebelled. So war fever was more intense in Galilee, but Jewish authorities in Jerusalem decided that if war was going to break out, they needed to be in control of it. So the war effort failed because they did not have adequate forces to defeat the Romans. not have a standing army trained to withstand the Roman military machine. And so their only successes were guerrilla attacks against unexpected targets. And the Jews themselves were so split in various factions that they were doomed from the start. From a biblical perspective, the destruction of Jerusalem was a judgment against the nation because of the rejection of that of the Messiah. Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, in addition, some of the parables that Jesus spoke. So the only account of the war is recorded by Josephus, who was himself a general fighting for the Jews, and he was defeated at Ramallah and surrendered to the Romans. And afterwards, he wrote a history of the war that was very sympathetic, as we would say, to that of the Romans. And in that of autumn of 66, he was when war broke out, the Assyrian legate, Cestius Gallus, invaded Judea and tried to storm the temple, but he was defeated and fled the country, and thus encouraging the Jews. So Nero appointed Vespasian to lead the attacks against Palestine in 67. He invaded and subdued Galilee, capturing Josephus. In 68, he defeated and subjected Judea and Perea and Idumea and Samaria, everything except Jerusalem. So he deliberately allowed the three factions in Jerusalem to do what damage they could do to one another before he attacked. So Vespasian encouraged the Jews to think that Jerusalem was invulnerable. And so in 69, nothing was done to protect the war, to prosecute the war. So Nero had died, and three different generals proclaimed themselves as Caesars: Galba, Ortho, and Vitellius. And in the end, Vespasian was appointed by Caesar. He led Palestine to go to Rome, leaving his son Titus to pursue the war there against the Jews. And in the spring of 70, Titus laid siege to that of Jerusalem, and the siege lasted 5 months. And in August, the temple was captured. Titus intended to spare the temple, but a soldier hurled a fire ran into the temple, and it caught fire and burned. The last contingent of the Jewish religion, the Jewish resistance, fled to Masada, where they held out for 3 years. And so in 73, Masada fell. And on the eve before the wall was breached, the Jews made a suicide pact that each father was responsible for killing his own family. So a group of 10 were selected by lots to slay the other men, and then one of the 10 was selected to slay the other 9 and then himself. All 969 killed themselves or allow themselves to be killed rather than fall into the hands of their enemies, the Romans. And so only a woman with 5 children escaped. So in the aftermath of the war, the temple, which is sacrificial system of worship, was destroyed. The Sadducees, who controlled the temple, did not survive the destruction of Jerusalem. The Pharisees, who established centers in Jamia and also Tiberias, survived the fall of Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin ceased to exist, but the synagogue survived. The synagogue survived. Isn't that something? That is something that was in the eternal purpose of God actually survived. Christians in Jerusalem fled to Perea, a little town east of Jordan, before the destruction occurred because of the prophecies that Jesus had given in Mark 13, Luke 21, and Matthew 24. The destruction of Jerusalem punished the push that of Christianity away from the Judaizing movement, furthered its universal appeal among that of the Gentiles. So years following the destruction of Jerusalem, around 132 to 135, there were Jewish uprisings in various parts of the diaspora, that of Alexandria, Libya, and Egypt, and also Cyrene, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. In each case, though, this uprising was ruthlessly defeated, and the effect of this and the rebellion of 66 to 70 was to alienate the Roman forces from the Jews, and previously friendly relations had existed between the two countries. And so in 136, Hadrian issued 2 edicts that stirred the Jews to open rebellion. First, he issued a decree forbidding circumcision as a part of large restriction not particularly aimed at the Jews. The Jews viewed this as an oppressive of their religious practice. And second, he planned to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and called it Elea Capitolia. There erect the temple of Zeus, and the Jews still viewed Jerusalem as their holy city, and so they had been irritated because of their temple tax was diverted to support the temple of Jupiter in Rome, and so the decision to erect a pagan temple in Jerusalem caused the amenity to break into that of open war. So one named Simon led the rebellion. He claimed to be the Messiah, and based on the prophecy that there would rise a star out of Jacob, he was called Bar Kokhba, the son of a star. And since the Jews used guerrilla tactics against the Romans, it took 3.5 years to root out all of the small guerrilla bands in the country. And the son of the star was killed. Hadrian carried out his plans to build the Alea Capitolia and forbid the Jews to enter the city, and thus ended the Jewish rebellion against Rome and their succession to that of the land of Palestine. So we see that many things took place in reference to that of our study of that of between the Testaments. We talked about the synagogue and how much the synagogue played a great role in that of the spread of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Even as we think about the service, the worship service, the organization of the synagogue. Also, we talked some about the Samaritans and things that happened with the Samaritans, their obedience to that of the gospel of Christ. And so also we talked of the religion of the Samaritans, and then there were after all of this took place, there were those sects of ancient Judaism. You had the Pharisees who continued. The Sadducees did not continue after the destruction of that of Jerusalem. You had some of the others that we had mentioned, the Essenes, and also the Zealots. We had tribes. We had the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls that we can talk some about. And we had just simply, as we would say, common people. So during all of this, reference to the literature that was produced during the time of the between the Testament, you had the Septuagint translation of the Bible. You had also the apocryphal books. I think one of the things that we ought to look at in reference to some of the apocryphal books, history books were First and Second Maccabees and First Esdras. The didactic books were the Wisdom of Solomon, the Book of Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus of the Syriac. And then the religious romance was Tobit and Judith, and then the prophetic was Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, Second Esdras, and legendary was the additions to that of Esther, the prayer of Azariah, or the song of the three young men, Susanna, the bell and dragon, the prayer of Manasseh. And so we looked at some of those and quoted from some of those, and also we read some of the pseudegraphical books, the Book of Jubilee, the letter of Aristides, the book of Adam and Eve, the martyrdom of Isaiah, First Enoch, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Sibylline Oracles, the Assumption of Moses, Second Enoch, the Book of the Secrets of Enoch, the Second Barak, or the Syriac Apocalypse of Barak, Third Barak, or the Greek Apocalypse of Barak. We had the didactic, the third, three Maccabees, four Maccabees, and Birach Ibalth, and the story of Hickar. We had the poetic Psalms of Solomon and Psalm 151. Historical, the fragments of the Zodiac there. So when we look at all those, sometimes we as believers of the Bible, we hear someone speak about the lost books of the Bible or the books that did not make it to the Bible. And usually they are speaking about the apocryphal, the pseudegraphical books. And so we simply point out to them that those books are not inspired of that of God. Therefore, that's the reason why they're not part of that of the Bible. I do appreciate so much being able to study the great intertestament period, or as we call it, hope that you've learned a lot from our studies, and that you'll be able to see the eternal purpose of God as it has been seen in reference to that before the foundation of the world and from the foundation of the world, that God had a plan. And yet to have that plan, many things had to be worked out. And as we've studied between the Testament, we saw many things did work out in reference to that of the things that would help the expansion of that of the church,
occupation of preaching and teaching the gospel of Christ. So it has been a good study. I appreciate you being that of our students.